Hey guys, this is Gabrielle Boucher, and this is the second week of our Generational Strategist certification. This week, we're going to be going over generational theory and really giving you an incredible foundation to better understand who are the generations, why are the generations, and what do we do with them. In today's session, we're going to be going over really, why generations matter, why this topic of generations is so popular, and really why the conversation is extremely relevant. Then we're going to go over how to define the generations. We'll go over, what each generational group is made up of, who defines the generations, and really prepare you to be prepared if you have any questions, whether it's in a training or by a client or a colleague, really equip you with some of the kind of most answered questions. Next, we're going to go over mastering generational theory. So what is generational theory, why it matters, how to interpret it, what resources to use. And then finally, I'm going to give you some kind of quick case studies, quick examples that you'll be able to use and apply that I think gives some good examples of how organizations can lead with generational theory in mind. So why generations matter? As you can probably consider with your own personal experience, your generation has really been a big part of what defines you. It determines how you communicate. So the technology that you use, the phrases that you use, whether it's, cool or groovy or rad, your generation determines the frequency at which you expect to communicate, who you like to communicate to, what even includes communication. It used to be communication was, drawing on the wall in a cave. Okay, that was a long time ago, but, now it's, emojis. So everything kind of comes back around, so to speak. It also determines how we work. The role of technology, I think, plays another, big one here. But, how we work, when we work-life balance is a really big topic right now that everyone wants to tackle. But work-life balance is going to look different for you based off of your age group as well as your generation. Your generation is also going to impact how you live. So, what are your priorities? What are your preferences? Why do you prioritize something in one era of your life, or, because of what's kind of influenced you as what needs to be important. So for example, one generation of young people, may really prioritize savings and looking towards the future. And another one might consider, experiences and living in the moment as more important. And they're using the money, they're using their money, but they're just using it different ways. So how they live is also too impacted by the generation you're a part of. How we buy, that's a big part of it. In this training, we're not going to go over a lot about consumer trends, but it certainly has a big part to play about how you buy things, why you buy things, what you prioritize when you're spending your money, because everyone really has finite resources. So your generation a lot of times can determine your priorities, and your priorities determine your spending habits. The big one is, of course, leadership. How you lead, a lot of it is determined by how you were raised, what leaders were really popular when you were coming of age. So was it, an Eisenhower, or was it a JFK, or was it a Barack Obama? What type of leader you saw in the White House, I think also too really can determine the type of leader that you're looking to become as well. How we parent. We're seeing a lot of trends about how the next generation, millennials, are parenting very differently, which, may include being more organic or more concerned about, exposure, being more concerned about the health and wellness, being more concerned about, that making sure their kids know to give back. All of that really, again, influenced by the generation that you came up with and what that generation considered was normal or healthy parenting. And of course, how we have fun. Now, sometimes that can all kind of come back around, because I'm sure that there are plenty of you who enjoy hanging out with people of different generations doing the same things. So it can be, listening to music, or it could be, going and playing outside, or, enjoying nature, or drinking a glass of wine, or whatever that is, connecting with people of different generations. But a lot of times, even, what is considered recreation and leisure can also too be determined by what generation you're a part of as well. Now, I've always loved this little cartoon because I think it's a funny and very kind of stereotypical reflection about really how different generations can really be. So here on the left, you see like in the 1950s, this woman saying, question nothing. And then in the 70s, this poor woman who doesn't shave her legs says, question everything. And then in the 90s, it was like just, questions. Questions are everywhere. There are too many. We don't need to answer them. And then, by 2010 came around, it was like enough questions. We need some solutions. So I think it's kind of a funny depiction about how, how people kind of change over time, and how a generation of youth can also too change over time. So now we're going to break down who are the generations and really get some extreme clarity about the generation. So you see here we've got traditionalists and boomers and Gen X and millennials. And the first question, whenever I'm training and I put this up, someone says, oh, so I thought that millennials were, or boomers were, and then they, have some number in their head. And so what we tell people all the time, and you'll hear this over and over again, is that we use the U.S. Census Bureau's information. All the data we use comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, which is really the standard for speaking about generations. So from a sociological standpoint, basically just social science, these are the terms that we all have agreed upon. So some research firms will kind of come up with their own numbers, and that's fine by them, but we use U.S. Census Bureau. It's the standard. So traditionalists are born between 1925 and 1945. Boomers are born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X born between 1965 and 1981. And then millennials are born between 1982 and 2000. So you can have folks that are kind of, say you've got a boomer who's born like in 64, or X are born in 65, and they kind of cross over, and so maybe they're not fully boomer or fully Xer, and that's great. So they're called cuspers is what we kind of refer to them. So if you're kind of in that 5-year window, if there's like a 5-year split, you're kind of in that cusper part. And I like to mention that when I do training, because I think it gives people permission to not have full alignment with their generation. Although that's always going to be the case. You could be smack dab in the middle of your generation and still not have, full alignment. So, I've included here kind of what those dates are for the cuspers. So that way you can kind of get a good idea, if they fall in that 5-year gap window, they may be able to, see some differences or, crossovers between the different generations. Now, this is a chart that I don't like using it because you have to keep updating the ages so that it's relevant. But I do think it's kind of helpful to have kind of a breakdown of, where kind of each generation goes. This one has the silent generation is a little off. But for the most part, I think it's kind of helpful just for you to see kind of how a generation breaks down. Now, you'll see if you look at like age ranges, or kind of like sizes of generations, I should say. Typically, generations are about 25 years, typically. So, and that's just been kind of how things have gone, again, from a social science standpoint. And William Strauss and Neil Howe, authors of Generations, kind of were the forefathers of who determined how long a generation was, and they kind of said it's 20 to 25 years. So that has kind of been what's really framed our discussion. But if you look at Gen X, Gen X is, significantly less than that. So, it's not just that particular, it's just a one and done 20 to 25 years. I think the social scientists who determine how long a generation is really take a lot of time to consider, what has influencing that generation, kind of the big life events that are kind of shaping the generation as a whole. Which kind of brings me to this concept of, social science in general, which I think is, maybe one of those terms, that many people don't really understand what it means. Or maybe they do and they just kind of pretend like they don't. So social science is the scientific study of human society and social relationships. So it's this really, frankly, it's a new science that has really kind of come of age in the last decade, but it's really been around for about 25 years, kind of in a really formal way. And it's important. I mean, you don't have to present on it. You don't need to really, geek out on it. I just think it's important for you to know that the social science side of things is going to be important, and there is real science behind what it is that we're sharing. This isn't just someone's ideas or someone's opinions, but it really is based in a longitudinal study of human behavior. So generational theory, on the other hand, is what is going to help us understand how a person acts based off of kind of the era, the time in history in which that person is born. And the importance of it, I think, is really what we shared about at the beginning. It really has everything to do with, who you vote for, to what you buy, to where you spend your money, to who you marry. It really has such a profound impact. So understanding what generational theory is really pivotal, because it's not just HR, which is where a lot of we spend our time in, is in employability and making sure that people really enjoy coming to work. It's really important. But what we're sharing with you, I think the power of it is that it is so mobile in its ability to really kind of adapt to different industries. So this is kind of a helpful, I think, reflection of kind of some cycles that generational theory provides us. So here on kind of the left-hand side, you see, that there's these different types of generations. So part of generational theory by Strauss and Howe is that these four different types of generations, and they repeat. So the prophet generation is kind of the generation who's speaking things out, making changes, really kind of disrupting things. The nomads are the ones who are very independent, kind of figuring their way out in the world, discovering truth for themselves. The hero generation is a very, justice-oriented generation that's going to kind of define truth and justice and really find a cause to fight for. And then the artists are going to be back to that more independent, but really focusing on community and on kind of the greater good. And so you see, in the generations we have right now, prophets are the baby boomers, nomads are Generation X, millennials are the hero generation, and Gen Z is that artist generation. And so you'll kind of see this 4-step cycle start over every 4 generations. So it's helpful. So on the right, we actually see it kind of coincides with some ebbs and flows in the economy, ebbs and flows in politics, ebbs and flows in history. So again, generational theory kind of shows that prophets kind of come to terms or come of age. So coming of age is like that 13 to 20-year-old time frame. Coming of age, in a high. So when there's a lot of economic prosperity, then nomads kind of come of age during an awakening when there's a questioning of culture and of standards. Heroes come of age during an unraveling, which we certainly saw with the Great Recession. And then artists come of age during what they would call a crisis. So that could be either a spiritual crisis, a financial crisis, or a political crisis. So really, I think a lot of times people can get very bogged down in this idea of generational theory, and really the role of anyone teaching is to interpret what is happening through the eyes of an expert on generations. And so it's not just saying here's what this book or this expert says. It's really, here I'm going to interpret what's going on based off of what I understand about generational theory. So I really want you guys to spend some time doing research in the materials and the books that you're provided in the coursework and the portal, because that's the visiting and revisiting of this information is really going to be helpful for you. But a lot of times people will say, well, okay, Gabrielle, this is great, this is interesting, but why is someone who's 22 today, why is that so different than when I was 22? And so here's really kind of the three big reasons that I share with people why this conversation is so incredibly important. And so the first is just the sheer numbers and the changing of the guard when it comes to generations. So reason number one, 10,000 baby boomers turned 65 every day in America. And I don't think many people realize how quickly everything is changing when it comes to the leadership in the generations currently. So if we have one generation, the boomer generation, which has really built so much of our economy, so much of our politics, so much of our businesses, to then shift and then give that leadership to the next generation, there has to be a pass off. There has to be a legacy discussion. And most people just don't realize how quickly that older generation is aging, which leads us to the second reason, which is that there just aren't enough Gen Xers. Remember when I broke down how Gen X is actually just a smaller generation? Time frame wise, the generation has less years, but also too just birth year wise, there wasn't a lot of Gen Xers being born. So when you look at the size of the Generation X is actually 1/3 the size of the baby boomer population. And that has a significant impact on leadership discussions, training discussions, retirement savings. I mean, the impact of this is really quite large when you realize that Gen X is smaller than the baby boomers that they're trying to replace. So if you look at a sheer numbers component, we see baby boomers retiring and there aren't enough Gen Xers to fill those leadership positions. So boomers are either having to be pulled back into the workforce, or Gen Xers are having to play multiple roles, or some organizations are pulling up millennials maybe even earlier than they should. So it's just important for us to realize that there are a lot of things at play that really require us to realize that it's not business as usual. And so really that leads us to number 3, that we really haven't had this type of situation before, that we've had 5 generations in the workplace today. And I'm going to now go into breaking down each generation's kind of some of their priorities, some of their benefits, some of the great things that they do, some of the challenges that they still have, because I think it's really important for us to understand how we all fit together. But the big question I think that people will eventually come into is, okay, so aren't you just, talking about archetypes? So I want to break down the difference between a stereotype and an archetype. So a stereotype is, we all know what a stereotype is. It's when you meet one person or one thing and you think everything is like that one thing, or every person that you meet who looks like that or acts like that, you think you already know them. And it can be really dangerous, but it's also too really phenomenal how our brains actually categorize information. And I think stereotypes worked out really well for us when we were, in caves, and when we had bears and wolves coming after us. We logged, okay, great, that one could eat me. You're not thinking, oh, this one's different, right? You're thinking, I know I've had experience with that once before, or I've heard about it. That's all I need to know. And so the same thing comes true with all of us as humans. So, whether it's, age discrimination or, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, whatever it is. There are mechanisms in our brain that actually are created to protect us that ultimately end up hurting us, I think, in the long run. So a stereotype is something that we want to run very far away from, which we all know how stereotypes come about, but an archetype is important. It's really something that tends to be true. So it doesn't label something unnecessarily, but it has more of a kind of studious connotation. So I tell folks as I break down generations, we're discussing archetypes, not stereotypes. So I'm not going to be talking about the millennial in her basement with a beanie and big glasses on, texting her friends. I'm not going to talk about that because that is a stereotype. But I can talk about the role technology plays, how this next generation communicates, their priorities on work-life balance, etc., because those are things that tend to be true. So it's important to bring clarity. And when working with audiences, they need to know that you have a standard for the information that you're providing them. You're not just, sharing personal anecdotes. Because there certainly is going to be some significant changes in how each generation is addressed. And as you see in the next couple of slides that we'll be going over really how each generation approaches life in its own unique way. Because each generation really does have its own priorities, things that they think are important, expectations, things that they kind of would assume go without saying. They have their own learning styles, and a lot of that is based off of how they were educated. So that's something to keep in mind. Their own communication styles, and a lot of that has to do with technology. They have their own appearance, so the way that they dress or act or talk, that's really unique. They have their own way of thinking, so their own processing, how they make decisions. They have their own motivation style, so how they want to be motivated and how they are internally or externally motivated. They have their own working style, so whether that's more collaborative or more independent. And of course, they have their own decision-making style, so how they determine, what's important, how to prioritize, and how to move forward. So now we're going to discuss, how do you master generational theory? How do you get that firm foundation to understand who is each generation, how they interact, and really what motivates them to be who they are? So we'll break down each generation one at a time. So the first is the traditionalist. The traditionalist is born between, again, 1925 and 1945. Some of their core values include respect for rules. They were raised in a very militaristic, very structured environment, so they're looking to have that kind of standard. They have a very dedicated personal loyalty to the organization or the company. They can be very frugal because they were raised during a time where they didn't have a lot, where the Great Depression was a part of everyone's very recent history. And because of that, being raised in the Great Depression and having that really impact the way they see the world, they were very, very frugal with their money and fiercely loyal. When it comes to work ethic, it wasn't as much of a priority to find fulfillment as it was to find support and to be able to live and provide for your family. So work itself was, for the most part, very hard, very arduous. You really made sure to not lose the job that you had because work was hard to come by. Coming in early was something that was just to be expected. So it was a very regimented, very structured lifestyle that the traditionalist was really born into and brought up with. So I like this as a visual to be able to show, it's a very structure, very top down, where people at the top are the ones who are making the decision and the people at the bottom are the ones who are executing on it. But there isn't a lot of collaboration. There isn't a lot of discussion. There isn't a lot of input. from each person at the bottom. It's really being told what to do. So when it comes to priorities, traditionalists really tend to, focus more on sacrificing for them their future, sacrificing for their family, sacrificing for others around them. So there is, this idea of extreme loyalty. Duty before fun, rules, those are all things that kind of came with the territory of what work was like for the traditionalists. Communication preferences tend to be as formal as possible. Keep in mind there was no, Twitter and Facebook or texting. So because of that, every generation, as you'll learn, their communication preferences really are based in how they communicated as they were coming of age. When it comes to authority, the traditionalist is really looking for respect and looking to communicate respect. And it's a very important part of how they communicate with one another. So respect is really key, especially respect for people in authority, respect for elders, respect for others. So, respect is demonstrated by distance and by deference. So that may look different than someone who's younger, where respect is communicated more towards, more out of relatability, which we see with the younger generation. So keep in mind, even respect may look different based off of your generation. This is one of my favorite feedback for traditionalists. Really, no news is good news. They don't need to know how they're doing. I had one traditionalist that we were working with said, the only feedback that I ever had was that I still had a job. And he said, if I lost my job, that was the feedback I needed, that I wasn't doing a good job. So there weren't, the 360 reviews, there weren't discussions about how to improve. It was pretty cut and dry. The team dynamics, work to get the task done, very utilitarian in their relationship with working on teams and collaboration. When it comes to, working with someone who's a traditionalist, face-to-face is key. Making sure that you're, familiar and being respectful of their preference and using technology, or even using technology to communicate or talking about technology. They're, fiercely loyal, and so they don't want to see people, bad-mouthing the management or the company. Again, respect is really key. And one of the key things I really love is, teaching people who are younger to take interest in the past experience and the input and wisdom of older generations to really make them feel valued and included. Okay, next we have the baby boomer generation, which is born between 1946 and 1964. Boomers were the largest generation that ever existed. But then they had kids, and now their kids, which are the millennials, are now the largest generation. But the core values of the baby boomer generation really focuses on participation. So they're looking at, making sure people are getting involved, they're doing things. There's an expectation that you will contribute, pulling your weight. There's a lot of kind of self-reliance in the baby boomer generation. They're naturally very optimistic, which they pass down to their millennial kids, at least the younger boomers who are millennial parents. Respect is also really key for them, and, really making sure that things are fair, access is available. When it comes to work ethic, boomers are very hard workers. They don't necessarily want to have people asking questions, because when someone asks a question, it can be seen as disrespectful. And so they're not looking for collaboration or input. They're really just looking for compliance. They're really looking at how much you can work and how much you can get done in a day. And so for a lot of boomers, it used to be, really bragging about how much you were working every week and how many vacations you didn't go on because you were working hard. And that was very much a badge of honor, which you can see kind of as one generation comes of age, their children, it's called a micro rebellion in social science, where one generation kind of rebels against the older generation. So millennials are rebelling against the boomer workaholicism, and now this generation is really looking at how do they have as much work-life balance as possible. So they have very different priorities, and they're oftentimes influenced by one another. Baby boomers and their priorities at work really focus on efficiency and process, procedure, think scalability. So a boomer is going to want to put something in place and make sure that it's going to last and that it's going to be able to grow and expand. So they're not really interested in one-off. They're looking at how do we replicate what it is that we've already done. Communication preferences tend to be very to the point. We don't need to talk about it unless we need to talk about it. And so it's very, very direct. When it comes to authority, this is the generation that was thought of, as saying, don't trust anybody over the age of 30. And then, they turn 31 and then, just kidding. But this generation really is one of the first young generations that really started to embrace what it meant to be a young generation in America. So really fascinating, kind of their generational identity. Feedback is really in the form of promotion or a title. Many boomers don't really feel like they need to have constructive feedback unless it's going to turn into something more tangible, like a raise, a promotion, your name on the door, etc. So tangible feedback is key. Team dynamics, people can work together and that's great. But for a boomer, they're really wanting to make sure that you play by the rules or get off a team. They don't want you just to be on the team to be on the team. They want everyone to, again, pull their weight. When it comes to, speaking at work in particular, here are some kind of key ways to engage with them. First is just to reassure them that their input is crucial to the success of the project. A lot of times young people don't know how to manage or work with people of older generations. So, saying things like, we recognize your unique and important contribution to our team, or we really, based off of your experience and what you've done in the past, we'd love to get your expert input on this. But really, again, the respect aspect is going to be really key. So making sure that respect is really seen as a two-way street for boomers and traditionalists is going to be key. All right, the next generation is Generation X, which is born between 1965 and 1981. Now, the core values of this smaller generation really have a lot to do with how they were raised as well. So Gen X is also known as the latchkey generation, and they're really known as that because they're one of the first generations where both of their parents were working when they were kind of coming of age. So they remembered what it was like to come home from school and, take care of themselves or maybe their younger siblings, figure out how to go to college, figure out how to, make dinner for themselves. So they're a very independent generation. They're going to be more casual than maybe the boomer generation because they were raised during a lot of the tech bubble where there was less emphasis on kind of the traditional career path and kind of an embracing of more technology and more casual workspaces. They're very, very independent. So because of that, they're going to, when it comes to working together, really look towards people kind of pulling their own weight. But of course, they're also not afraid to challenge authority and buck the system. When it comes to work ethic, Gen X really was very focused on making sure that they, found a great job and a great career. They were looking for stability because many of them didn't have that stability growing up. They aren't necessarily in a position of work-life balance, but I think Gen X also too, because of how they were raised, work-life balance is also too a heavy priority for them as well. And when it comes to, the role that work plays, unlike baby boomers, Gen X is more looking towards work to play a role in their life, but to not be their entire life. So priorities at work for Gen X: get the task done. Gen X loves checklists. They love getting things, handed to them and then handing things off to other people in a very neat and very clear way. And that's going to be really important when you understand that this generation is going to kind of lead from that mindset of, you are responsible for what you're responsible for, and I'm responsible for what I'm responsible for, and we don't need to over collaborate. Gen X is very familiar with email. Really, these distinctions of technology were much more important maybe 5, even 7 years ago, but I think that they're becoming much more mixed between the generations, as generations are now kind of communicating together all at the same time. Gen X has a skeptical but respectful relationship with authority, whereas millennial may come in and challenge why things have been done that way, and then shake things up and kind of protest until things happen. Gen X may have thought about what the millennials are complaining about and complained about it, but not actually done anything or made as dramatic of an exit as maybe the millennials have. And I think part of that is that these two generations are very similar. They have a lot of the same priorities, especially when it comes to work-life balance and just the role of work in general. But what I tell people often is the big difference is that there are more millennials than there are Gen X. So because there are more of us, we have been able to kind of stomp our foot, so to speak, and get more of what we want than maybe Gen X didn't have, that going for them. Feedback for Gen X: they like it, it's helpful, but it's not going to be, completely necessary. So they're not going to quit if they don't get feedback, for example, whereas someone in the millennial generation just may. When it comes to team dynamics, Gen X is going to be, very independent, preferring to work alone or to do things kind of on their own, in their own way, as opposed to, maybe someone in the millennial generation who is going to want to work together. Strategies at work: looking towards technology to communicate quickly is going to be important. Feedback is going to be helpful, but it's got to be on, something specific, like their performance, and tied to a specific goal. Being conscious of their time, because time is important, and again, independence is important. That's going to be how they view and experience respect. Titles are not going to be as important to Gen X. Freedom is more of a priority. So whereas boomers, if they're doing a good job, they may want to have a corner office or a better title, Gen X may want to be rewarded with more time off or more flexibility. Now we're at the millennials, that massive generation. So millennials are now the largest generation that's ever existed, thanks to our parents. And our core values really focus on a standard optimism that really the world is going to be better, and be better because we're a part of it. A civic duty of really coming together, kind of a justice orientation that this young generation has. There's a confidence that this generation has and encourages, and I think part of that is how this generation was raised, but also too because of technology and social media, there's a support system that maybe other generations didn't necessarily have that has really caused my generation to be very confident as well. Millennials are very achievement oriented. I know that's not because all millennials got trophies as children, but really because this generation was raised where it was very competitive to get into college or to get a job. And so because of that, there's a very kind of internally competitive aspect of how the millennials grow and go and do things. And of course, there's that sociability of being able to connect with people constantly, and having a community at their fingertips is really important to them. When it comes to work ethic, this generation has a tendency to move from job to job at a very fast pace. On average, they say that millennials will have 13 plus jobs until they find their kind of core career, and then they'll still rotate after they find that career path as well. Everything for millennials really comes down to the word experience. So they're looking for an experience, not necessarily a job. So they're looking for something that's going to make a difference, something that's going to be fulfilling, not just something that's going to get them paid. And really, they're looking for a lot of clarity about who they are and what they're doing. We break down the millennial group even further. I'm going to share with you kind of the 4 subgroups here in a moment, but we actually think it's very helpful to show you that because it's such a massive generation, our research actually leads us to believe there's 2 subgroups. So millennial group A, which is the older part of the generation, born between 1982 and 1990, and millennial group B, which is born between 1991 and 2000. So there are 2 subgroups because really we started to find that millennial group A and millennial group B, so like a 22-year-old and a 32-year-old, were going to be very different. And not just because that they're in different seasons of life, like one might just be graduating college and one might just be starting a family, but we just started to notice that their priorities were different, their preferences were different. So here in a moment, I'm going to break down this generation even further. So when it comes to the millennial generation, their priorities at work really focus on multitasking, being able to make decisions on their own, but doing multiple things at once, knowing that their work matters and that there's a core, clear mission that they're personally being involved with. Now, it's important to clarify this because every organization pretty much in the world at this point has a mission statement or a vision statement or both. And many organizations I work with will encourage me and say, oh, well, we have a really great mission. And they may, and that's great. But if the millennial on their team, really, if anyone, but particularly if a millennial doesn't feel personally connected to that mission, then they're not going to feel that it's a mission-driven organization. They're just going to say, yeah, we do this thing. Like we, might work for an association that, or a nonprofit that cleans up the oceans, and that's great. But what is it that I'm doing that's personally making that possible? So it's really important to find a connection point between the person and the mission. Communication preferences, really unsurprisingly, is going to be focused on technology. So, text message is going to be key because there's an immediacy, and there's also although ironically you can, get a text message instantly, it also lets you kind of think about it and respond on your own terms. So there's also an independence in texting as well. When it comes to authority, millennials are really looking to challenge, but also to learn from authority. So respect is important, but it's also a two-way street. Whereas other generations, respect was based off of age. Millennials really see respect based off of expertise or experience. They're looking for feedback really in an instantaneous way. There's an expectation around constantly knowing how you're doing and how you can improve. When it comes to teams, this generation really is looking to a more collaborative work environment where they're able to kind of give and grow and learn from one another at all times. When it comes to working with the millennial generation, here are some keys that will help you understand how they work. The first is social media, IM, SMS, text messaging, email, all really are going to be an expectation that this next generation has, that communication is going to be constant and easily accessible. Respect has to be earned, but really it has to be overly communicated as well. So understanding how each generation views respect, and that this generation isn't going to give respect maybe as other generations in the past, which was more focused on authority, title, experience. The next is you have to really explain the big picture, the context, the why behind why everything works together, why it's important. This generation is really looking for others to provide that context, at least on the front end, and then they'll quickly be able to provide that context for themselves as they grow in their own individual career. This generation is really looking to accomplish multiple things at a time. So oftentimes that means that they'll be looking at different projects, different programs, launching multiple things at the same time. And so finding effective ways for them to be able to feel like they're doing multiple things at the same time, which also too engages different parts of their brains. This generation is very left and right-brained. And so because of that, they're looking at how they can do, maybe something that is more creative, but also too something maybe more numbers oriented. And so really you're not seeing the clear divide between maybe an accountant and an artist. You're seeing the two really blend together in the life of the millennial. So now I want to break down kind of the 4 subgroups of millennials, because I think it's important, if not, it's at least very funny to think about how this generation can be kind of divided into these smaller groups. So the first is what we call the unattached. The unattached are part of millennial group B, so they're the younger part of the generation. And you'll be able to download the attachment. I know in our worksheet that you guys have in your binder, there is an opportunity for you to kind of write down each of the generations, but I'm going to do something specifically on the subgroups of millennials because I think it's important for you to have this kind of in your back pocket and to present on and just to understand. So the first is the unattached. So born between 1991 and 2000. So this is part of the younger group. These are what we typically refer to as, stereotypical millennials. So they're not looking to commit to any one thing or any career or any opportunity. They're really keeping their options open. And so the unattached are, looking at kind of what makes sense for them in this season. So they may be touring the world or, trying different things, but they're really exactly what the name sounds like. They're just really enjoying being young and they're not looking to settle down anytime soon. Next is the explorers. So this is also part of that younger group. So they're born between, again, 1991 and 2000. And they're called explorers because they're already starting to demonstrate that they're interested in some sort of personal development or professional growth. So maybe they are in school or taking internships or doing things that are kind of outside of the norm, demonstrating that they're interested in kind of taking themselves and their lives to the next level. And these are really a lot of the young people who are self-starters, who are entrepreneurial minded, who are, taking their future seriously. And these are a really amazing part of the generation that it's a real joy to be able to work with. The third subgroup we labeled the distracteds. Now, I didn't label these. There was a great research study that actually produced a paper on this, and we've been kind of growing in our own research around these 4 subgroups ever since, because we thought that it was really helpful to be able to articulate the differences between the generations and even the distinctions between the millennial generation itself. So the third group are what we call the distracteds, and they're called distracteds because they're in a time of their life that really is them settling down, getting routines. Maybe they've got a great young family. They've bought a house. They've got a good thing going with their career, but they're the older part of the generation, so 1982 to 1990, and they just aren't really looking for anything extra. So they've kind of settled into what's going to be their new normal, at least for now. And that's a really great person to have on your team because they're going to be loyal because they're looking for their version of stability. And that stability may look very different. Their stability may not look anything like your stability, but it's stable for them. And the final group are what we call the activists. So the activists are, again, part of that older part of the generation, but they're going through something I lovingly refer to as the quarter life crisis. So they're considering, does my life matter? What am I supposed to do with my work? What's next for me? So they're asking a lot of key questions, which are important, but they're also too looking for kind of what's next. So they're looking to switch things up after they've already been in the workforce for maybe 5, maybe 10 years. So now I want to share with you some specific case studies, examples based off of some interviews and work that we've done to show how organizations have been able to kind of embrace some of the best practices and studies on how to, bridge the generation gap. And this is going to be a perfect lead into next week, where we go into the programmatic side of things, the solutions that some of these programs can provide. So case study number 1 is Domino's Pizza. Now, I don't know if you remember or not, but Domino's Pizza came out with a campaign a few years ago, and it was hilarious. I loved it. They just came out and they said, "We know our pizza sucks." And that was pretty much it. That was all of their campaign slogans. It was really focused on raw authenticity and accountability of them saying, "Yeah, we heard you. We know you don't like us." And that really started this incredible campaign to turn themselves into a very sleek, very pro-millennial, very kind of edgy company. And it was a risk, absolutely. It could have just totally blown up in their face. I think that the key is, if you're going to come out and admit that you're doing something incorrectly, that you need to commit to improving it and actually make it happen. And Domino's did that. So they were extremely authentic. They really focused on getting the input from their store owners, their franchisees, from their employees, from the community at large, from social media, because they really wanted to have people feel like they were a part of this comeback story, which I think is really, really powerful. The next piece of it I thought was really interesting was, they've got a really great app, which is really focused on quick and steady solution. It's very clear that Domino's Pizza really focused on millennials and really bringing an accountability and kind of a partnership with the millennial generation. And I think this is important because I like this as a case study that Domino's Pizza has gone from a brand that people didn't really find any confidence in to now being something that is really touted by the millennial generation as a really incredible company, because the millennial generation, for example, now it kind of feels like they're a part of kind of making this story come alive. So through a lot of humor, Domino's has been able to incorporate some really cool storylines of how you can get better pizza and get it delivered to you. Now there's pickup zones and, cool apps that you just, hit a button and a pizza will be delivered to you. And so it's using technology and community and authenticity to reach a generation. And I think it's a good example to go after, because I think Domino's represents a brand that many organizations can pattern themselves off of. Whereas I hear a lot of organizations, after hearing my talk on generations, and we'll get into some of the programmatic side of things and how this gets implemented next week, but many people say, well, we're really great with one particular generation, but not, some of the others. And so I wanted to, give this example of how one company, Domino's, and I'll give you another one here in a moment, was able to, through raw authenticity, admit that they're wrong, ask for help, and then make that a part of a long-term strategy to get a multi-generational approach going. Because here's the truth: when it comes to a brand, and we see this in marketing, but also to an employment, is if you get the younger generation, the older generations will come along. But if you just go after the older generations, the younger generations will never come along. And so going after the youth is always an effective strategy when you're looking at getting new ideas out there. All right, here's a second case study. So we went in and interviewed one of the heads of HR for kind of the main company that owns many restaurants, including the Chili's chain restaurant. And it was fascinating talking to them about how they've been able to change the way that they are training their staff. And they were having a hard time keeping their employees. And this wasn't just a millennial thing. This is really just everyone. And so what they decided to do was to start listening to some of their employees and finding out what their employees really wanted. So first they gamified the training. They realized that a lot of the people who are working, whether it was a line cook or a host or waitress, they weren't really interested in sitting in a classroom or doing a PowerPoint or reading a book. A big part of their job was interacting with people face to face and using kind of computer screens to program things. So they used how they're working and how they were educated to communicate with the people on their staff. So they gamified the training, meaning they took a lot of the training, the HR side of stuff, the safety stuff, a lot of the compliance information, and then packaged it in a way and used a gamification platform, which we have some great friends and partners in that space who did that with us, and ended up doing some pretty incredible stuff. They also determined that a lot of their employees were having a hard time really feeling like they could make a decision on their own. They didn't know what a good decision was or what would happen if they failed. And so being able to decentralize that decision making to clarify what failure looks like, and again, back to that respect piece, because every generation is going to respond differently to how structure is given, whereas one generation, like boomers, for example, may be looking for structure and millennials not looking for structure. How do you create something that has enough structure for baby boomers, but also to enough freedom for the millennials? So decentralized decision-making, Chili's actually found that worked really well for them. They were also looking at their benefit structure and making sure it made sense for their employees instead of just making sense for the company. So they asked a lot of questions, and they found out some people maybe wanted pet insurance, or they wanted, some money or a voucher to, do some preventative work, like maybe even, getting a gym membership included in the benefits. And so because of that, they were able to provide options for their employees to personalize their plan for their benefits, which made sense, particularly for the Gen Xers and the baby boomers who are really looking at creating something that had that stability that made sense for them and their family. And of course, just having overall a fun culture. That way people really felt like, they wanted to enjoy coming to work. And part of that fun culture also included accountability with their employees. And so they started doing courses on things like financial wellness and, savings and how to buy their first house. I mean, many of the things, frankly, that a lot of employers would say, oh, well, that's not my responsibility. They started to take on themselves because they realized that their employees were really coming in and they didn't have some of the kind of common sense training, which is so funny. I tell people all the time, common sense is really only common to the people that it's common to. So, for example, one generation, common sense was balancing a checkbook. But for a younger generation, common sense is downloading an app. And so because of that, you have to kind of think about where your employees or your teammates are coming in from, what's common sense for them, and then kind of meeting them where they're at. So Chili's, for example, realized that some of the common sense things that maybe they were raised with wasn't common sense for the next generation. So based off of kind of some of the feedback and focus groups that they did, they created a program that made sense, that really kind of empowered their employees at all ages to really feel like their organization was giving back to them and invested in their personal and their professional success.